You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Trudy Truitt.
Authors. I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Beau L'Amour on the show with me today. If you have been a lover of great adventure fiction, of great American West fiction, you know the name Louis L'Amour. Most of us have, cycled through dozens of his novels throughout our lives, probably. And Beau is the son of Louis L'Amour and has taken a role as kind of curator of the L'Amour estate and is doing so much great work with the body of work that Louis left us, a lot of his unfinished work, and then also what we were just talking about before we started recording. Beau told me about this new project that he's taking on to give us a unique look into a lot of Louis's work that is out there. So welcome to the show, Beau.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Well, thank you. It's so good to have you. I know that I probably completely butchered what it is that you do, but we're going to get into all that and let you kind of tell your story. But before we do, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Wow, I've got no idea. That's really interesting. I think I was probably 8, maybe 8 or 9, and I had a borrowed movie camera, and I was trying to do animation with little, those little green GI toy soldiers. And somehow at 8 or 9, I knew that if I just shot one frame and then moved them, it would sort of look like something. And I remember doing that. I wasn't really, initially my feeling was that I was going to be a filmmaker. In fact, all the way through my first year of college, I was relatively positive that I wanted to be a director of photography. And then as I got more and more into it, I realized that that was an ongoing commitment to chemistry and physics and camera equipment, and it started feeling like it was further from what I really cared about doing. and I got more into the writing and directing aspects of things, and then eventually I kind of converted completely. I call it to the code. Okay, the code being the alphabet. The computer code that assembles images in your mind, and and so sometime after I don't know, probably around the time I was 30 or so, or around the time my dad died, maybe when I was 28, I kind of got more and more serious about, doing most of my work in the area of literature.
I ask a lot of people, Beau, what was your environment like growing up, and were you surrounded by creative people? And I like to see how, our parents rub off on us and that sort of thing. We all know your dad, or feel like that we knew your dad and are connected to him and his work. What was that like growing up with such an icon of American literature? And was it, as a kid, did you realize who he was and what he did? Or was it just dad who's in there, pounding on his typewriter?
Well, because we're all trapped in our own reality, it felt completely mundane. I grew up in a little house in West Hollywood, just above the Sunset Strip, which was a fantastically beatniky area, and it was full of nightclubs, and eventually, by the time I was 8, 9, 10 years old, it was full of hippies, and it was maybe not the environment that you'd expect Louis L'Amour to be in, except my dad wasn't. He was fairly well known, but he wasn't particularly well off at the time, and so it was it was kind of a typical existence for a writer who made his living on the edges of Hollywood. It was that kind of neighborhood, and it was fairly mundane. I mean, I can remember being very excited. I had a classmate in elementary school whose father was an airline pilot, and we were all very excited about what he did. My dad sat in a little room and typed.
Right.
And then, maybe when I was in my mid-teens or early teens, a phenomenal. I mean, it was long growing. It was something that didn't burst on us like an explosion, but a phenomenal thing happened. None of my dad's books went out of print. I mean, this had been happening. Everybody was always expecting a few of them to go out or be less popular, and that just didn't happen. And until today, it has not happened. And but at a certain point in the mid 1970s, a couple of things happened. One, the critical mass of books in print was so large that we really started doing better and better. And so our household finances improved tremendously. And then while a lot of people were sort of abandoning the Western genre sort of reached out and took over counterculture. So if you think back to, and this doesn't really express it perfectly, but if you think back to like bands like the Eagles or something like that, there was an aspect where kind of counterculture and Western culture being seen as kind of rebellious culture. And so it merged with sort of hippie culture. And then all of that went kind of popular, and it sort of just diffused out into society at large and didn't really become one thing or another thing. It just kind of became everywhere. And luckily, my dad's popularity was just on the upswing of that, and it caught that rising wave, and it caught the interest in American origins that occurred because of the bicentennial and various things like this. And he started writing books that took place earlier in American history at the same time. and very presciently recognizing that was happening. And so we were able to sort of ride that wave to, I mean, that's probably why you know Louis L'Amour today. If Louis had stopped writing in 1970, I don't think anybody would remember him, even though it's very likely that, you know, half of his work was prior to then, and I think some people might even say some of the better books were written before then. But he caught this particular rising tide and rode it to, you know, incredible fame. And so it was much later in my life and very late in Dad's life. I mean, all of Dad's serious success took place between age 70 and age 80 when he died.
Wow. He was what you would definitely refer to as a working writer. He you know, he showed up to work every day, because if he wasn't publishing, then you guys weren't eating.
Oh, that's definitely, I mean, if he didn't write 3 novels a year, we didn't, you know, if he didn't write 3 novels a year, we didn't maintain a middle to upper middle class lifestyle. And like I said, the only reason we burst out of that was because his writing was so infectious, none of the books went out of print.
That is amazing. In the work that you do now for his estate, what exactly do you do? What is your title, and what does your daily work look like?
I'm vice president of Louis L'Amour Enterprises. My mother is president. That doesn't tell us very much. Let me see if I can. When I first started working in the movie business, I worked for a really terrific producer named Bill Finnegan, and I was sort of an assistant to him, an assistant to other producers working in his group. And at one time, very early on, I said, you know, you got to just explain to me exactly what does a producer do? And Bill kind of smiled and he said, anything it takes, or whatever it takes. I think he said whatever it takes. And that's really true. You know, you are in some ways, in some aspects, you're kind of the boss, but you're also the person who's supposed to either fill all the gaps or make sure someone is filling all the gaps. And so that is really the kind of ethos that I have taken to our publishing efforts. So I do whatever it takes. Now that means I do some marketing, I do some art direction. I very rarely lay out a whole book, but I work with the artists quite a bit. You know, I have worked in the film business. I've worked in the film business with my dad's stuff. I've worked in the film business just to have a job. I have done a lot of books on, you know, audiobooks. And some of those have been these kind of very interesting sort of dramatized audiobooks that are, I hate to say that they're like an old time radio show, because some of them are, we intentionally did them that way. And some of them are also intended to be the most up-to-date expression of that medium possible. So they're not really intended to resemble old-time radio at all. They're intended to be the best, you know, like a movie with the picture shut off you could possibly produce. And so I've done that. I've worked in the magazine business, you know, published a magazine for a couple of years that was dedicated to it was the Louis L'Amour Western magazine, but we only ever published one Louis L'Amour story. So it was really an avenue for other Western writers. And then just, you know, done everything I can and, you know, to support my dad's work. So that means finishing or rewriting dozens of short stories to either, like I said, finish them or bring them up to date. I didn't take credit for any of those back when I was doing that. More recently, I've been working on the Louis L'Amour Lost Treasures program, which has several aspects to it. One of them is 2 books, Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volumes 1 and 2, which are unfinished or unpublished stories. And I'll give you in that book, you can read the unfinished thing, and then I will go through and say, here are Louis' notes, and this is how it shows where he was going with this particular story, or what he expected it to do, what function he expected it to perform in his career. I'll give you sort of the story behind the unfinished story. There is in the Lost Treasures program also, there is a novel, No Traveler Returns, which was Dad's first novel that he wrote when he was about 30. And it was kind of a pile of unfinished chapters. And I was reading through it, a few years ago, and I suddenly realized what it was. And I was sort of like, oh my gosh, I know what this is. I know exactly what he was trying to do with this. And it was very different. It was very innovative. It's an extremely different story than almost anything else he ever wrote. And we can revisit that in a moment if you want. And then one last element is there's also the Lost Treasures Postscripts. So in about 40 of Dad's sort of classic finished novels that have been out there for years, I go in and I do a Lost Treasures Postscript, which is sort of a bonus features in the back that kind of tells the story behind the story, or just anything associated with that novel that really that I think would be interesting to the audience. Everyone, the subject matter is very different.
And which is absolutely fantastic work that you're doing, and breathing new life into stories that maybe we've read before, or people are newly discovering these stories and getting a new glimpse into a writer that they've respected and loved. When your dad was alive, did you guys talk about writing? Did he ever impart any writerly wisdom to you?
A little bit, but Dad was very reactive. He had trained him. He was an instinctual writer. He hadn't always been an instinctual writer, but he trained himself kind of intellectually to do it when he was a lot younger than when I knew him. So, but when he was in his 30s, he did that, and he had gotten to the point where he had ingrained those processes so deeply in him that he didn't have to think about it very much. Now, that's one of the reasons his work is kind of joyous, because he didn't agonize over things, but he also wasn't particularly good about imparting, kind of the intellectual framework or something like that about writing. I'd have to say I got most of that from studying acting. I learned a lot about writing from studying acting.
When you're reading over his manuscripts and what do you as a reader and as a son, because it's probably hard to separate the two, what do you feel like are some of the reasons that people fall in love with his stories and his style of writing?
Dad trained himself to write directly from his unconscious, and he often didn't know what he was going to do on the next page. And that sense of sort of discovery, that sense of being carried along, of being with the writer in the creative process as it's happening, is something that I think a reader can pick up, a reader unconsciously picks up from reading his work. And so it's, I think you're very, very in the moment with the writer. And Dad wrote very fast, and and sometimes he was a little bit sloppy, but I think the speed and the energy and the love of doing it and the love of finding out what happens next is something that a reader kind of catches on to, and they're just transported by that in a way that maybe a writer who writes more slowly and agonizes over everything, that writer is, what you're getting out of that writer is the intensity of perfection rather than the intensity of discovery. Neither one is better than the other, but my dad was definitely the intensity of discovery.
You likened writing to acting, and said that you learned a lot about writing from acting. It sounds like your dad almost approached writing like an improv actor.
Oh, and in many ways, it's very similar. So when you're learning improv, you basically train yourself to kind of open the door to your unconscious, and it's painful and it's laborious. It takes a lot of practice, and if you don't stay in training, you start to lose it. And my dad was extremely nervous about not writing every day. He definitely knew that if he didn't keep the doors open, the process of training them to open again would be very difficult. And in my work, I often do projects that are quite creative, but then I transition into an extremely technical aspect of it, like doing like writing and then producing a film, writing and then producing and directing, and partially, I have a friend that I work with who's really the good editor, but editing an audio drama, or we did a graphic novel not too terribly long ago, and so first it was getting the graphic novel script nailed down, which was very creative, but then there was all of this technical stuff about getting every single frame of that thing, every detail, every piece of paper clean, every dialogue balloon in exactly the right place. And the technical stuff just slams the unconscious creative doors closed. And then getting them open again is very difficult.
What sort of notes did your father leave behind? I know you've got a couple of books of his unfinished manuscripts, like we talked about it, and some of those you have finished, some of those you have collected and published kind of in their in the state that they were left in, and then some of things like you talked about the postscripts, you've taken some of his existing novels and then have given us a window into maybe what your dad was thinking and what inspired something, and maybe cleared the window for us where we could see the story a little better. What did he leave you, and what's it like been going through the things that he left behind?
For a guy that sort of claimed that he didn't outline things, he did leave behind a lot of notes. It is true that his unfinished work, the work that's in Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volumes 1 and 2, one of the things that makes those works interesting is those are things that he did a lot of outlining on. So there was a fair amount of information about what those stories would become. It's also possibly why they're unfinished, because as soon as Dad found out what was going to happen with the story, he was considerably less interested in writing it. And so it's possible that the stories that started resisting him, he then did more planning on them. And as he got the planning worked out, he started being satisfied that he knew what was going to happen, and he wasn't quite so intent on writing the story to discover what the story was. And so it may be why some of those went by the wayside. So there's a strange interaction between more planning and less finishing in his case. I'm very much the opposite, but in his case, that may be true.
It's very interesting to see the his creative process and what made it stop and what kept the fire going. When you found one of these, and you mentioned a story earlier that you found the thread for it, and like, aha, I know where the story's going now. Do you find yourself slipping into his voice when you're writing? There might be 5. I don't know that readers would necessarily recognize that, but when you have my job and you've spent a lot of time under the hood, so to speak, there are about 5 different voices or different writing styles that he had throughout his life, and I'm quite good at 4 of them. The last style, a slightly more kind of flowery, or maybe less
less stripped down prose than he wrote in earlier. That style I'm not so good at. So that's a style that started showing itself in the 1970s, occasionally, late 1970s, occasionally, and became more and more common in some of his work in the 1980s. And I'm just glad that I've never had to be in a situation where I had to sort of write in that voice. But the other ones are quite easy for me.
When doing the postscripts that you've been working on, what sort of information are you drawing on, and what's it like to revisit those stories and to help us get a better look at them?
It's been really incredible. I mean, it's been kind of a time machine back, because quite a few of those these are novels that I'm doing this for, so quite a few of them were written during my life, and so it's kind of a trip back in time in some ways. But I will look at the materials where he was talking about a certain story if there's enough to justify putting a postscript in the back of the book. I never want to lightly put a few little details into a postscript and kind of trick somebody into buying a book, when there really wasn't enough material there to justify it. But I'll see what's there, and I kind of get it organized. I'm working on the one for the Daybreakers right now, and so it's tracking the beginning of the Dad's first inclinations about writing about the Sackett family, and then where that went, what he knew about it, and then the next group, the next lump of information that I have from him in his notes, in his correspondence, in his journal, and things like that, go to the creation of the television miniseries in the late 70s. And so I'm right in the process of starting to describe how the television project got going, and the various ways that he was involved, which is not much. Novelists are very rarely involved with the motion picture production. We did, he was a little more involved in a couple of cases with a certain producer, not the producer of the Sacketts. But then in other postscripts, like the postscript to Callaghan is all about us driving around in the desert doing research on the desert road forts and things like that make an appearance in Callaghan. And the reason for that is he described several days of doing that in incredible detail in his journal. And so I thought, okay, so this is definitely the material that's going to go in there, and my own memories of it. And then in some cases, I just finished doing a postscript on the novel Taggart and the novel Kiowa Trail. And both of those novels, not the entire postscript and certainly not everything about the novel, but in both of those novels, there's a very, very important aspect of their creation that was tied to my dad's friendship with Katharine Hepburn. And so I have written about that, in those amongst a number of other things.
Wow. Have you ever come across information that surprised you, maybe about your dad, or about, a twist a story takes or something like that was a surprise to you?
I have sometimes been impressed that the way he planned a story might, from my perspective, now this is looking at if I was the writer, not from Louis's perspective, if Louis was the writer. Occasionally I have said, well, if I was writing this, I would much rather stick with the original idea that shows itself in the notes rather than to go and do what he eventually went and did with it. And so that was a little bit interesting. But I think the most interesting thing is not so much anything he said, but what I discovered was a very clear plan that he never talked about. So Dad was able to break into writing paperback originals and in the Western genre. And he was fairly successful at that. And after about 5 years, he thought, well, I want to break out and I want to write in other genres. And he started trying to do that, and no one was interested. And so this is actually the time period, 1960 or so, when he wrote The Walking Drum, which is a very, very popular novel of his, but it didn't come out for 25 years. And so he was not able to do anything outside the Western genre. And so he sort of dropped back, reassessed, and then he said, okay, I'm going to change the way I do the Western genre. I'm going to start writing stories that take place earlier in the evolution of the American West. I'm going to start doing stories that take place during the era of the earliest North American voyages of discovery. I'm going to look at aspects of this situation that are not the ones that people normally look at, because I can't just write cattle drive stories. I have to entertain myself, and I have to do things that I'm interested in. And so I need to write different things. So, at first he wanted to write all different kinds of genres. They wouldn't let him do that. So he said, okay, so I'm going to widen the Western genres until I'm happy with it. And it was like a 15 to 20 year effort to sort of broaden what he could do. I'm not saying he was doing this for anybody else, or he was trying to change people's perception of the Western, but he was trying to broaden what he could do with the Western, and then eventually open his audience and the publisher and the booksellers to selling books like The Walking Drum, which takes place in Europe just after the Crusades. Excuse me a moment, I'm going to get rid of this. And then also Last of the Breed, which was a Cold War thriller, and The Haunted Mesa, which is a science fiction story, and he could do all of those things and get away with it. So it's it was an amazingly complex, long drawn out, subtle plan. And it was very clear he was intending to do it, but he never said a word about it. And so that was like, oh my gosh, look at him go. Look at him. He's just, he's got such a vision of what he wants to do and why, and how to respond to the market and his lack of success in various ways and things like that. It was very, very impressive, and I was very surprised to discover that.
It's such a breath of fresh air to hear that in today's market economy, where a writer needs to come out with a blockbuster and knock it out of the park, as opposed to this idea of kind of being a mid-list author. Who was a working writer who showed up every day, wrote books, published books with a kind of a grand plan in the background. That's almost unheard of today.
There's plenty of people. They just happen to write like Kindle originals.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, it's a separate, but the Kindle market, or the self-published. I don't like saying that, because it's kind of a lot of people in the publishing business look down on that term, but the people who write electronic only novels their way of dealing with the business and what they're doing and what's going on in that world is identical to what the paperback business was doing in the 50s.
Right. Indie publishing now is kind of the pulp publishing of then.
Yeah, it's the paperback original. The hardcover publishers looked down their nose at paperback originals. They thought they didn't think anything about them. They thought it was a fad. They thought it was going to be over with. They thought Americans didn't read. They couldn't believe the millions and millions of books that were being sold. And the mainstream, kind of big five publishers today look at what's going on the indie or Kindle side. Identically, they're making the same sort of mistake.
Right. Well, speaking of that, I know that you are involved in marketing and always have your ear to what's going on, in publishing to try to get these stories out to a new audience. Are you finding technologies like the Kindle and like the new boom with audiobooks, which is so funny to me, because one of the biggest growth markets right now is books harkening back to old time radio drama, which I think is just hilarious. But that's where the most growth is right now, it seems. Are you keeping your ear to the ground and what are you doing to bring these stories to a new audience?
Well, as much as possible. Unfortunately, in recent years, most of our stuff is our westerns, and it's not really the way my dad wanted to have it, but that's what was selling. And in the last decade, the audience has sort of pulled away from that and found it to be a little bit irrelevant. I fear, with a lot of the things that are going on in our culture today, the coronavirus and things like that, that may actually send people back to reading westerns. I mean, I would hate to have any success on the back of a worldwide tragedy, but one of the things that American audiences do when times are tough, we have noticed this during recessions and things like that, that the Western market picks up some. And so, that's going on. We're chasing the way you can chase a fragmented market today a lot better than you could a few years ago. So the market's been fragmenting for a while, but the ability to chase it slowly opened up with social media, and then the social media platforms started closing and narrowing what you could do on them, and it became kind of harder and harder. And then new social media platforms started popping up in different places, and so it's just you just have to kind of keep watching that and watching what's going on. I mean, we are getting down to the end of the new titles that we will be able to produce. And so, in a very short period of time, we're going to be kind of a legacy only company. So that question might have been a little better a number of years ago, but we've been in audio publishing since 1985. We were doing audio dramas. We started doing audio dramas, and so we did our last what will probably be our last audio drama about 4 years ago. So that's something we did throughout that period. And, we're just going to have to see what's next. I mean, all of our titles are on Kindle, and have been since that became available. We were in the electronic publishing markets before the Kindle showed up, back in the days of glass books and things like that. So, I mean, one of the things that was very interesting, I'm not sure that it will continue anymore under the Random House banner, but back in the days when Bantam was really Bantam, Dad was, I don't know that he was their most successful author, but he was kind of their most evergreen author. Sort of like you could always count on sales from him. And so they used him with our permission and great enthusiasm. They used my dad to test a lot of different ideas. And this is why we were some of the first people in the audio publishing business. My dad, was one of the instigators of doing audio dramas back in those days. He thought that would be a lot of fun. And we tested, we did a magazine of new Western fiction that was also under the Bantam Dell banner. And that was something that they wanted to test out. So we've done a lot of it. They experimented a lot using him because I think they felt like they couldn't get too hurt by experimenting with something if Louis was attached to it. And so, we've kind of been at the forefront of a number of things. It's going to be interesting to see what's next, and we're ready if they give us the opportunity.
Beau, as a creative person, like I know that you are, and you're constantly working on your dad's stuff and finding new ways to present it and add to and all of this. What do you do to preserve your own creative voice? What do you do to make sure that Beau keeps a fresh way to express yourself?
I actually don't worry about it at all. I consider anything that I do where I'm putting creative energy into it, I consider it to be as much mine as anybody else's. That's probably an ethos that kind of comes from the movie business. If you hand a script to a makeup artist, they go through that script and they say, oh, this person gets cut here, and then they have this funny thing there, and they do this, and on this day the woman's wearing a little more makeup in a certain direction, and they interpret everything and they just commit their own creativity to it, and that's what they're paid to do. And I feel exactly the same way when I work on No Traveler Returns, this novel of my dad's, or a number of the short stories, like I said, that I did quite a bit of work on that I really didn't take any credit for back in the 90s and early 2000s. Those are things that, I gazed into those stories and saw the thing that I thought my dad was valuing there, and said, okay, so I need to do this. I think I'm working on another novel now, that is probably his last novel, which is sort of a 60s era thriller. And it will probably be much more my voice. But with No Traveler Returns, especially because it was his first novel, I was extremely careful to keep it orbiting around exactly what his voice was at the time when he wrote it, and to just look into what his life would have been. Now sometimes when I work on a story that if I have to go in and change things in a story, I do a lot of research on what Dad was doing at the time and what he knew at the time. And so if I take things out, I often will put in aspects of his life that even he didn't put in. And so, I'm thinking in one story, there's a guy in a boxing gym, and I had to change some stuff. And so when I came back to the boxing gym, I made it Wiley Spivey's, athletic club in St. John's, Oregon, which is a suburb of Portland, and used descriptions that he had of it from the 1920s, and so sometimes that's important. When I was working on No Traveler Returns is a seafaring story set in the 1930s, and Dad wrote a lot about San Pedro, a port that he had shipped out of, but he had been there in the early 20s, and by the 1930s, San Pedro had changed considerably. And so to make it accurate to the time that he was writing about, I had to go in and change some things about his descriptions of San Pedro because they had changed. But I also found things from his life and found elements that he seemed to be interested in using in other stories and things like that, and put them in there, to just keep up the level of Louis when it came to the difference between Beau and Louis.
Gotcha. So Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volume 1 and Volume 2 are those collections that we talked about that you took unfinished treasures of his and brought them to the page finally. The books that you've been adding the postscripts and updating information, are those in the Lost Treasures series? The books that are republished under that banner, is that the ones we can find that in?
Yeah, there's kind of a orangish yellowish banner across the top. It says Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures on those paperbacks. So anytime you see that on a novel of Louis, that's an indication that I have gone in and told some interesting stories about how that particular book was created.
Fantastic. How many of those under that banner have been republished now?
I think we're over 30. I'm always a little I don't know how many have been republished, so probably 20-ish, maybe more. I'm always a couple of years behind, or ahead of where the publishing company is with this stuff. So I always have to kind of remind myself where they are with the schedule versus where I am with the schedule.
Gotcha. We will put links in the show notes of this episode where people can find all of those great treasures. Beau, if people are just learning about you and the work that you do, and God forbid if they're just discovering Louis for the first time, is there a place online where they can connect with you and dig into this vast back catalog of all the things that you guys are doing?
All of our websites, so louislamour.com, and then if you go to louislamour.com and you sort of scan down the left-hand column, you'll get to a point where it says additional websites, and there's a website for Lost Treasures, there's a website for our graphic novel, there are a couple of websites for the last two audio dramas that we did that go into what the audio dramas are and how they were made and things like that, and just exhaustive detail. And there's one that's about Louis' kind of 20th century adventure story writing called Louis L'Amour Great Adventure. And so there's a lot of reference material online.
Excellent. We're going to link all of that in the show notes of this episode. Beau, this has been so much fun chatting and digging into all this great stuff that you guys are doing. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right. Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to its...
Some things you write now, do they differ in the writing process from
plants? Looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.